Welcome everybody to the final CERC seminar of the semester. Last but certainly not least, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Sebastian Dettmann, who is an assistant professor of political science in the School of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University. His research focuses on Southeast Asia and in particular Malaysia, the topic of his talk today, as well as Indonesia. He's interested in political parties, electoral competition, democratization, as well as other topics. He's received his PhD from Cornell University in 2018 and was a postdoctoral fellow in contemporary Asia at Stanford University 2018 to 19. His research has been published in a number of prestigious journals, including Democratization, Journal of Contemporary Asia, Electoral Studies, and Southeast Asia Research. So without further ado, Sebastian, let me hand over the floor to you. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to Mark and Diego and the Center for inviting me to speak today. So today, I'm going to present a bit of research that I've done based on some field work I did in Malaysia, as well as some ongoing co-authored work on the subject of Malaysia's recent election in November of last year. So I'm also happy, I know there's people online as well, but I'm also happy to, make this sort of a conversation about whatever people are interested in talking about. There's a lot of different facets to this election that I think are relevant for people who study not only Malaysia, but more broadly, people who study comparative politics. What does Malaysia kind of help us think about in terms of elections in a very kind of uncertain and new era of its politics. Okay, so obviously, for the big headline events which have taken place over the past several months and in fact several years in Malaysia, really kind of I think defy what we knew about Malaysian politics up until recently. As of November of last year, Malaysia's new prime minister is Anwar Ibrahim, who of course was the longtime opposition leader, whose chances of becoming prime minister, it seemed even a couple of years ago, had seemed to be increasingly remote. Yet now he is the prime minister. Another kind of fascinating and unexpected turn in Malaysian politics is the government which is formed that has Anwar as the prime minister. And this includes Anwar and his coalition Pakatan Harapan, the Alliance of Hope, as well as BN, the Barisan Nasional, the former long-running dominant party authoritarian coalition, which had led the country for several decades, since 1973. And then UMNO has an even longer history of rule in Malaysia. So the fact that this coalition government involves both Pakatan Harapan PH as well as BN, of course, is unprecedented in Malaysian history. There's a lot of kind of firsts taking place in Malaysian politics. So the obvious question is, how did Malaysia get to this point? And what does it mean? What are the implications for Malaysia's politics and sort of the process of democratization? The final aspect of the more recent election that I think has grabbed a lot of people's attention, even for those who don't study Malaysia, is the unexpected success of PAS, which is a conservative Islamic party, very long-running, long history in Malaysian politics, did unexpectedly well in this election. And some observers have termed this the green wave and argue that perhaps this is a sign of things to come in Malaysian politics, that youth voters also swung quite hard or heavily towards PAS. And this, of course, raises more questions about what does this mean in terms of ethno-religious politics in Malaysia, ethno-religious polarization, which has been so present in recent politics, and of course is a much longer history in Malaysian politics more generally. So in this presentation, I'm going to do a whole lot of different things, and I want to cover a bunch of different points, and maybe this will, hopefully this will give those who are already familiar with the case some sort of new data to work with, but also those who are not super familiar with Malaysia touching on some what I think are salient points about Malaysia and kind of understanding where it's going. So I'm going to start with sort of a brief overview, a very kind of potted history of Malaysian contemporary politics. I'll talk a little bit about the campaign, the lead up to November 2022, when the election happened. Talk a little bit about the electoral results and trying to understand how these kind of deep-seated religious and ethnic cleavages, to what extent do they still predict or explain the outcomes that we saw in 2022? Or is Malaysia kind of turning to some new paradigm of politics, as some have kind of long predicted? And just to foreshadow the findings, based on some co-authored work that I'm doing with Tom Papinski, basically we find no, ethno-religious structure, especially at the district level, still is a very good predictor of voter behavior. So at least in the short term, nothing has changed. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the post-electoral environment. So it's still very early days in the Anwar government, but and of course, predicting anything in Malaysian politics these days is a difficult thing. But I'll talk a little bit, or maybe speculate a little bit about what we can see going forward in Malaysia. Okay, so this is going to be familiar with anyone who's studying Malaysia, but just to kind of give a very brief overview of Malaysian politics. And I would also say that I'm going to periodize this in a particular way. You could argue for different periodizations, but this is the way that I've set it up here. I think we can say that, essentially since 1973 and UMNO even longer, there was a very stable competitive authoritarian system which prevailed in Malaysian politics, that really didn't see any serious, some challenges along the way, but 1999, the Reformasi movement, even prior to 1999, and then the 1999 elections kind of set the stage for what we're seeing in Malaysian politics today. All of the major, or some of the major players and parties emerged at that time, and I think some of the patterns of political contestation that emerged in 1999 are still visible today. And another way to understand politics since then is simply to say, what we see in Malaysia now is what happens when a dominant party starts losing its voter support and its electoral support. And during a period of a couple different elections after 1999, but especially after 2008, you just see BN and UMNO, which had formerly dominated politics in Malaysia without any real electoral threat, really start to decline in terms of their electoral support. And 2022 is just a continuation of that trend. And UMNO's presence in the parliament, in the current parliament, is just a real shadow of its former self. And BN's presence is much smaller than it used to be. At the same time that this period of BN's decline, you get also the rise of a rival coalition, which of course has taken on a couple different names during different periods, and there's a more complex history with it, but let's just call it Pakatan Harapan, or PH, for the purposes of this presentation. And PH, of course, is the backing coalition for the current prime minister. And you start during this period, you see the emergence of what seems to be stable two-coalition competition. After 2018, PH wins the election, unseats the BN, and you get this period of instability leading up to November 2022. And then now, since 2022, right, November 2022, since the election, you have this government where PH and BN essentially combine forces, and you have a third coalition in opposition. Okay, so let me just review some of the aspects of Malaysian politics which are relevant to understanding what's going on in the lead up to November 2022. And hopefully this doesn't confuse anyone. Certainly confuses me sometimes because there's so many different twists and turns to this political story. But essentially in 2020, after 18 months in power, the Pakatan Harapan government collapses. And everything after that gets fuzzy, right? There's a period of party switching even prior to 2020, but you get a lot of people moving away from UMNO, from BN after 2018. And then the 2020 collapse of the government precipitates even more people who are switching parties, new coalitions emerging, new alliances emerging as well. So what seemed to be a relatively stable two-coalition competition has gotten considerably more complex after 2018, but especially after 2020. You get 3 different prime ministers, 4 years, from 3 different coalitions, and these are the 3 coalitions which played the biggest part at the national level in the 2022 election. So again, we've got Harapan, which I mentioned, Perikatan Nasional, which is a new coalition, and then BN again takes the prime ministership. And without talking too much about the sort of nitty-gritty, why was there an election in November of 2022? Essentially, at that time, it seemed that BN, which was again in the position of heading the government and having a prime ministerial position, it seemed that the BN was in a decent shape in order to contest elections. There's a number of state elections where BN did quite well. And also, there's the factor of parts of UMNO leadership. Of course, it's a speculation, but many people feel that since they were under corruption, they were facing corruption charges. They were very eager to have an election in order to come back to power, and hopefully those trials and corruption cases would be dismissed. So they were very quite eager to sort of get another mandate and shore up their support in government. Okay. So to talk about the 2022 election, again, you see a complex map of coalitions and independent parties, which are not all the independent parties are reflected here, but you can see at least some of the major coalitions here. And what you have, what I'm going to talk about today are mostly the 3 major national coalitions, so BN, PH, and PM. But you can really see how complex it's become. And one of the aspects of the sort of fragmenting of political power after 2018 and 2020 was that the regional blocs of the Sabah Sarawak parties essentially broke away from BN and created these regional parties. And Warisan, which used to be allied with Pakatan Harapan, is now was not officially part of Pakatan either. Okay, so just to lay out a couple differences between this election in GE15, as it's called, and with 2018, which is the last election, you can really see what a dramatic change it was in terms of the fragmentation and splintering of Malaysian politics. First, as I mentioned, you're going from this essentially 2 coalition competition in 2018, albeit with a 3rd kind of spoiler party PAS in 2018, going to essentially 3 major national coalitions and a couple regional coalitions. And what's I think important to highlight here is that even though PAS, that conservative Islamic party that I mentioned before, played a role as ran in a whole bunch of different constituencies in Malaysia, they were not a serious contender in the majority of those districts. However, in 2022, you had 3 serious contenders vying for the majority of seats in the country, which again was kind of an unprecedented aspect of Malaysian politics. Another thing to note here is that Malaysia has a first past the post single member district system. So we wouldn't expect that this kind of 3 coalition competition would happen, because what happens when you have 3 or more contenders in an election? Well, they end up splitting the vote, especially if they're kind of aiming for the same batch of voters, which is what happened with this election. Okay, another aspect of this is you get a dramatic increase in the number of candidates running. Apart from the 3 coalitions, which each nominated a candidate each in a given district, there was a whole bunch of new independent candidates running. There are independent candidates in other elections in Malaysia, but This is a major increase. There's like 11% of candidates were independents in this election compared to 3% of the previous election. So what this essentially means is that Malaysian voters going to the ballot box saw a whole bunch of more options than they typically would see in an election. Another aspect of the new election is that, of the last election rather, is that there's a massive increase in the number of people who are voting. And the reason for this is legislation which was passed in Malaysia, which allowed for automatic voter registration. And then also the changing of the voting age to 18 from 21. So what that means is you're enfranchising a whole bunch of youth, and you're also enfranchising a whole bunch of people who have never voted in elections previously. There's other changes which we can talk about maybe if people are interested, but I think these are some of the major differences. And of course, the major question is here is, how do these new voters respond, right? Especially for youth voters who are they're not tied to any particular political party or partisan allegiance, at least in terms of their voting record. And also the fact that the electoral map is just that much more fractured, right? For those of us who study or follow politics, it's confusing enough. For those who are just kind of peripherally interested or following campaigns, it's even more complicated, right? So this is a really, I think, challenging situation for voters to deal with and contend with. So the question is, how do they deal with the situation? How do they end up voting? Okay, so I'll leave aside the kind of that's sort of the overview section, and I want to talk a little bit about the campaign. Some of this is based on field research that I did in Malaysia prior to the election itself. And so just to mention a couple major issues, as always, and maybe not surprisingly from a comparative perspective, issues of the economy and cost of living were high at in voters' minds. Surveys prior to the election suggested people were really concerned about these types of issues. Things like inflation have also hit Malaysia quite hard. Recently, the COVID-19 crisis and the lockdowns were also quite punishing on the economy. So a lot of kind of economy, cost of living concerns coming up. And not surprisingly, if you look at the manifestos of the parties, they really emphasize these types of issues and all the sort of promises in terms of targeted subsidies and targeted government largesse, all targeted to voters were very high on the list. In terms of the campaign itself, it's quite short, which is also quite typical for Malaysian campaigns, just 13 days. And these are kind of out of order here, but as mentioned, the manifestos offer kind of this usual mix of economic messaging and also some sort of reform messages. And I'll talk a bit more about the branding of the different coalitions in just a second, but they all kind of promise some level of institutional change, some more sweeping than others, at least rhetorically in the manifestos. Another aspect which really came out in this election, which was just kind of solidifying previous trends, was the increasing salience of online media and mediums for the campaign. So Malaysia has long been known for having in-person campaign events, campaign rallies known as ceramahs, especially on the Pakatan Harapan side, on the opposition side, for a long time. There would be these massive rallies where everyone would come out and show their support. They're very spirited types of campaign events. And all the UMNO and other parties would do a lot of door-to-door campaigning and really kind of this like personal touch aspect of politics was quite important. But I think this election, a lot of people, my own observations and other people's observations, that this has kind of retreated a bit. And there could be a number of different reasons for that. One could be simply the after effect of COVID, and people are just reluctant to go to these events. A lot of people were speculating that this meant that voters are just disillusioned or not very happy with how things are going. So they're just simply not turning out to these events. And so you saw reduced turnout of different campaign events across the country. At the same time, alongside the manifestos promising these economic messages and the usual sort of messages of unity, at least rhetorically, there's some pretty intense ethno-religious politics, which again is typical for Malaysian political campaigns. Maybe in some ways more heightened because of some of the dynamics we'll discuss in just a moment. But yeah, so you get kind of a mix of messaging coming through in the campaign. So let me just talk a little bit about the three major coalitions which I described before and what kind of branding or messaging that they really kind of put at the forefront. And these are photos that I took in different parts of the country during the campaign. So as I mentioned before, PAS is a conservative Islamic party, which is part of a coalition called PN. And PN's message was really one of hammering home their Malay identity and their Islamic identity, right? So really putting forward themselves as the sort of clean Islamic inspired governance alternative to BN. BN, of course, the long-running coalition, didn't really need to introduce itself in any particular way because voters are very aware of what BN is. However, BN, of course, has lost a lot of its luster, at least amongst voters, as we've seen in this election. But BN was, in some sense, was able to offer a message of things used to be more stable back in the day. Vote for BN again. They'll provide sort of return to stability, return to continuity. And a lot of the campaign events reflected very typical UMNO BN messages to voters. And same for Pakistan Harapan, PH, right? Anwar's coalition, which has always had sort of a more progressive, multiracial, multi-ethnic messaging with promises of reform. And of course, Anwar was always seen as sort of a reformist figure in Malaysian politics. And again, if at the rallies for PH, a lot of this emphasis on these types of things, right? So economic issues, but also, reforming, offering some reform of Malaysia's institutions. So in terms of Malaysian, the sort of where these parties place themselves within this larger political competition. So PN and BN were both trying to attract the same group of voters, the Malay Muslim electorate. And PH, well, would try to appeal to the Malay Muslim electorate, also has been most successful in recent elections in sort of multi-ethnic urban constituencies. So unlike previous dynamics of or previous eras, you really saw, BN used to be a much more multi-ethnic coalition, but they really, over the last several elections, have really lost a great deal of their multi-ethnic support. So both PN and BN are both aiming for that Malay Muslim ground. Okay, so just to kind of fast forward to the results in terms of the coalitions. After the campaign period, everything, all the dust settles, people go to vote. You see an unprecedented result in Malaysian politics, which is not one single coalition won a majority to form the government, the new government. And this has never happened in Malaysian politics. It was always the case that BN, up until 2018, was the one which would form the government, and then PH in 2018. Now you have a situation where none of them made it past the 112 mark, which is what you need for a majority in Malaysia's parliament. And as you can see, the lack or what's this? So the distance to 112 is pretty dramatic, right? It's not just a couple seats; it's quite a distance, right? So this, of course, leads to the post-electoral period where there's bargaining between the coalitions and eventually the new government. I'll get to that in just a bit. But I just want to talk more about the results. So of course, the other kind of headline here is BN's support has cratered. They've really become a much smaller coalition than they ever were before. And the GPS, the regional coalition, GRS, these are both regional coalitions in Malaysia, did quite well in their respective regions. Okay, so how do we understand the results, and to what extent does the sort of ethno-religious structure of Malaysian politics predict what happened in this election? So first is a figure I'll show you, which is looking at West Malaysia only, because East Malaysia is more complicated and there's other variables at play, but simply looking at West Malaysia, because the 165 parliamentary seats, you can see that the seats in which the three coalitions, national coalitions won, are very much structured along ethnic lines. So in the most heavily Bumi Putra, that is the indigenous community of which Malays are the majority, especially in West Malaysia. So when this figure says Bumi Putra, you can just read Malay here. In the most heavily Malay districts, PN was victorious. In the districts which are more heavily skewed towards Malay voters, but a little bit more multi-ethnic, PN won a bunch of seats. And then finally, in the least Malay seats, PH did the best. And if you've read about Malaysian politics before or followed previous elections, this is very much in an existing pattern. This is not new for Malaysian politics, this kind of ethnic structuring of who wins. Of course, the only wrinkle here is that there's three coalitions rather than two. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some co-authored work that I'm working on. I mentioned before with Tom Lipinski, and in this article, we're trying to understand how did voters respond to this very confusing electoral environment, and to what extent did this kind of ethno-religious structure continue to predict the outcomes? So in this figure, this was produced by Tom, which is why it looks a lot better than my figures. But in this figure, you can see the vote share in West Malaysia plotted against the percentage of Malay voters for the three coalitions. And this is kind of similar to what I was showing previously here, but now this includes losing districts as well. So as you can see here, Barisan Nasional, the more, or BN, the more you get, the more Malay voters there are, the higher the vote share, although it's not as strong as it has been in previous elections. For Perikatan Nasional, you see a very strong correlation between the vote share of PN and the percentage of Malays. And then finally, in terms of PH, the fewer, the more Malays rather, there are in a given district, the lower the vote share of PH. So this is a really, consistently strong finding, not only in this election, but in previous elections. And again, the importance of this this ethno-religious structure and trying to understand or predict voter outcomes is still extremely strong. If we think about something like urbanization, which is sometimes brought up as another variable in the context of Malaysian politics, arguing that maybe it's not really something about ethnicity, maybe it's something about being urban or rural voters. But we find that it's really not as significant a predictor as ethnic structure in terms of voter outcomes. And in fact, if you look at the three coalitions across urban, rural, and semi-urban constituencies, essentially the vote share doesn't change across those. So in other words, urbanization is not really a significant predictor of the outcome. And what's interesting about this election, compared to other elections, is that the Department of Statistics in Malaysia has now released demographic data at the constituency level, which they've never done in previous elections. It had always been scholars would use, either just purely look at something like voter density, population density, and ethnic identity, and maybe like GDP at the state level to try to understand these what's going on here. But as of 2022 and going forward, hopefully, the Department of Statistics now has a whole bunch of new variables or sort of demographic information at the constituency level. So you can put in things like the GDP level, percent unemployed, number of factories in a given district. So there's all these other sort of additional variables that could be put in there. And it turns out that none of them are really significant except for this ethnic variable. So our argument here is not that ethnicity is determining people's or ethnic structure of a district is determining people's vote, but certainly something is going on, right? So, and I'll talk a bit more about why that is. Okay, so actually, yeah, let me show you this. So, actually, let me start with, as I mentioned, ethnic structure is a strong and significant predictor. Urbanization is less significant, except for a couple different exceptions, which I can talk about if people are interested, but probably won't discuss it here. So why is this happening? So again, as I said, we're not making an argument about the deterministic nature of Malaysian politics, or that people are so preoccupied with ethnic identity that trumps all considerations. However, at every kind of aspect of Malaysian political competitions, ethnicity comes out in some manner. So the first is in terms of nomination choices. In these figures, we look at, again, this is from our co-authored work, we're looking at which party in a given coalition is nominated by the coalition to contest in a given district. So what that means is that for all of these coalitions in any given district, they have to choose which party is going to represent or to run, put forward a candidate for that particular district. And this is an interesting kind of negotiation. It's subject to all sorts of negotiations between the parties within the coalition. They often have disagreements and so on. But what's clear in this election, and indeed in previous elections in Malaysia, is how strongly ethnicity can tell you whether or not a given party is going to contest in a constituency. So let's take PH, for example. Pakistan Harapan, as I mentioned, is the sort of more progressive, multiracial coalition. It comprises of a couple different parties, which hew to different audiences, across the sort of ethnic spectrum. So Amanat, the one in blue here, is a party which traditionally, or is an offshoot from PAS. Their appeal is to basically progressive Muslim voters. The DAP has typically been, or historically been most strongly identified with ethnic Chinese, ethnic minorities. So let's just focus on those two at the beginning. As you can see, in a given district, the more Malay voters there are in a given district, the more likely it is that Pakistan Harapan is going to choose a Malay Muslim party to run in that district. So maybe that's not surprising, right? But at the same time, what this means is that, and across all of these different coalitions, they make these types of choices, right? So the more Malay voters you have in a given district, the more likely it is that it's going to be a competition between Malay candidates and Malay parties. So what that means is that if you live in a 80 to 90% Malay district, you will not have a candidate which is not Malay, right? You will not have it's with very rare exceptions will there be, especially when you get to the higher levels of Malay majority districts. So we argue that, of course, this incentivizes to some extent a ethnic outbidding process, right? You have multiple voters in, let's say, a heavily Malay majority district. You have multiple parties claiming to represent the same audience, right? And of course, what this does is it incentivizes candidates and parties to emphasize their credentials along those lines. It doesn't minimize it. You might think it means other issues are important, but in fact, it seems to incentivize competition along those lines. And it also means that voters have very little chance to vote against the grain in terms of their in terms of ethnic identity. Another aspect is we argue that ethnic identity still operates as a powerful heuristic for voters, and this is not unique to Malaysia. There's research in a bunch of different contexts which argue that, especially in contexts like Malaysia, where it's kind of on the path to democratization, voters need some cues to understand how to vote. There's new parties, new coalitions, politicians who have switched sides. So ethnicity and also partisan identity, coalition identity, which is often at least partly based on ethnic identity, are simply easy heuristics for voters, right? Especially for new and first-time voters. And each of the coalitions rather, had positioned themselves very explicitly around a given ethnic or religious identity. And then finally, I think campaign effects matter too. As I mentioned, there were sort of two sides to there are always kind of two sides to Malaysian campaigns. The ones which project a broad economic based message, which doesn't talk about ethnic groups in particular, says that they will represent all Malaysians. And then there's the other side of campaigns which often emphasize ethnic identity, and especially the recent history of Malaysian politics is that PH in particular was identified by its opponents as being as threatening sort of the Malay supremacy in the country, as eroding Malay rights. And all of this came up to some extent during the election and the campaigns as well. One of the prime minister picks for the coalitions from PN, Muhyiddin Yassin, there was a widely circulated TikTok video of him talking about Christianization taking place in the country. He didn't identify PH as being the culprit, but pretty sharply divisive or polarizing messages. And so all of this, we argue in our paper, is that this kind of racial paradigm in Malaysian politics, which suffuses all aspects of its political competition, still remains very relevant and salient in Malaysian politics. So despite all of the changes and shifts that we've seen in Malaysian politics, this kind of racial paradigm still prevails. Okay, so I also want to qualify some of what I've described and also not say that ethnicity is the only determiner of people's vote choice. In fact, of course, we can't really say why people make the choices that they do. And it's certainly, I think, important to acknowledge that there are other reasons that people voted the way that they did in this previous election. So first question is about this green wave that I mentioned, right? So this is the phenomenon where PN and POS did extremely well in what's sometimes termed the Malay belt of Malay belt of voters. So these would be constituencies in the east coast of Malaysia, and even farther south than in previous elections. So one argument is that this shows there's sort of a revival or a continuation of Islamic politics or Islamist politics becoming even more predominant in Malaysian politics. But it's also clear that this was a vote against UMNO. UMNO, as coming into this election, had its former president and prime minister jailed, Najib, for 12 years because of corruption, and its sitting president and some other major figures implicated in corruption cases. So really, this message also came through in some of the campaign, right? That UMNO and BN had lost its way, that they were corrupt and so on. So it's also clear that this vote for the more conservative Islamic coalition was not simply because of ethnic or religious identity, but also kind of a protest vote. And this is also seen in terms of who within the PN coalition won. POS, the major party in the coalition, Win did very well, but so did Bersatu, which is a party, a former splinter, or sorry, a splinter party from UMNO, which doesn't really have a strong party identity, doesn't really have a compelling message, I think, frankly, but again, they're kind of the alternative, palatable alternative for Malay Muslim voters who didn't want to vote for UMNO or BNP. I know I'm running out of time, but just to run through a couple of other things here. The regionalization of coalition and party support is also quite interesting in this election. As I mentioned, POS in the Malay Belt, and then local parties and coalitions in East Malaysia. I'm not going to talk too much about this aspect of it, but happy to talk more if people are interested. Okay, so let me just briefly cover some of the post-electoral environment. So, as I mentioned before, no single coalition had a majority of seats to form the new government. So you end up with a very kind of unlikely coalition government. So consisting of Anwar as prime minister, his PH coalition, and this is Zahid Midi, who's the current UMNO president. So the matchup between PH and BN. So the first kind of question about this this coalition you might have is, will this survive? There's sort of inherent tensions within this coalition and within UMNO itself about whether or not this coalition is beneficial for UMNO and whether or not it's actually hurting their standing amongst Malay voters. And maybe during the Q&A we can talk more about this if people are interested in it. But I think the first big test of this will take place this year. So in July, there's 6 different states which will hold elections. State elections are all, and basically non-parliamentary elections are often considered bellwethers, fairly or unfairly, for the national political scene. So how well or how poorly BN and PN do in this election, I think will probably play into some part into the longevity of this current governing coalition. And then, of course, the other sort of question here is thinking about the reform agenda, the larger process of democratization in Malaysia. And I think I've got some, let me just, I'll end on that note, actually. So let me just conclude briefly and talk about what I think we're discovering or having here in Malaysia. Sorry, my clicker is getting rental. So let me just use the keyboard here, sorry. So I think the question is, what is Malaysia a case of? If we're thinking more broadly beyond Malaysia, thinking about Southeast Asia or more comparatively, there's a couple different ways we can think about Malaysia. And of course, it's still very early days after this election, but looking more broadly over this long time period, we're kind of seeing what happens when you have a dominant party system decline. A number of comparative cases around the world, countries like Mexico, like Japan, have had these former dominant parties which lost power, and a process of, especially in a country like Mexico, there's a process of democratization, and then at some point the former dominant party wins again, right? They come to power again. And UMNO has kind of had a very tumultuous time over the past several years after losing power. So what happens to UMNO in the very at the end is an open question. But it's certainly clear that from comparative cases that it's very possible that UMNO and BN will make a comeback at some point, whether it's sooner or later is unclear. But I think a lot of these dynamics, this fragmentation, all people switching allegiances and parties and so on, this I think is a reflection of what happens when a single coalition cannot hold things together in the same way that they used to. I think at this point, one could argue that Malaysia is, it's certainly electorally competitive, right? Now we've entered this era where Malaysian politics is no longer dominated by a single coalition. In fact, no single coalition can hold power. So it's much more electorally competitive than it ever was. However, the illiberal aspects of Malaysian politics have not disappeared. Is it a democracy now, or is it a halfway, hybrid regime still? We could argue about that or talk more about it, but at least the illiberal aspects are still there. And in fact, we still see them coming out even under the new government. That being said, I think this kind of more fragmented, uncertain electoral environment is here to stay, at least in the short term, probably for the long term as well. Okay. So just what comes next? A couple speculative things, and again, maybe this is something we could talk about. First, I think we can argue that the reform agenda is unlikely to take place in the short term. Part of that is a reflection, of course, of the unlikely political coalition which is in power right now. As far as I can tell from what I've been following from afar, they're very much concerned about not replicating the same mistakes that the Pakistan Harapan government did in 2018, but they're also being very cautious, right? They don't want to move too quickly. They don't want to alienate voters, and especially because they're facing these state elections very soon. And so some of the major changes that reformers would like to Malaysian politics, a change in its electoral system, reducing gerrymandering and malapportionment, all of these kind of things, I think are unlikely to take place anytime soon. But I do think this more fluid political system is here to stay. It's unlikely that again we're going to see in the short term at least the sort of dominant party coalition dominance that BN used to have. So what comes next, I think, is really uncertain, and in fact, whether or not this three coalition competition can exist in the future is a big question. But the sort of post-electoral governing coalition negotiation or coalition formation, which is something new for Malaysia, I think at least in the short term will continue to exist. And finally, just to end on the note of coming back to this idea of ethno-religious identity, it's still as salient as ever in politics and society. I think, again, we'll have to see how this comes out in terms of the new going forward, but it's not gone anywhere, and I think this will continue to play a major role in how political actors think about Malaysian politics. So I'll end there, and then looking forward to any comments, questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Stefan, for that. And Calvin, will we need to pass around the microphone for the questions? Okay, from there. Okay, sure. Diego, you want to start off the question? Okay.
This was off.
It was off.
Okay.
Really? Get entire time.
Well, now we know. Good question. Thanks for the lovely presentation. Very interesting update. So first question, you mentioned at the beginning how this was this very substantial change in the electorate because of turnout, very different turnout numbers. I am wondering to what extent is this related to the very substantial political changes in the party systems that you described? Is it the case that these new voters were perhaps more inclined to vote for the new coalition between PAS and Bersatu, and if so, why? The second question is more related to your conclusions here. I was also wondering if we often think of Malaysia as other cases in Southeast Asia as political systems where competition is often clientelistic. Can you also see Malaysia after the 22 elections as a place in which perhaps you also see a transition away from clientelism towards a more programmatic or ideological way of competition? Is it the case that you have this more progressive coalition with PH, and then a more conservative one with Bersatu and PAS, and BN occupying some kind of ideological middle center?
Great. Thanks, Diego. Yeah, good question. So on the first one about turnout, so I don't think I put turnout here, but turnout was lower than in GE 14, so the previous election. But I think it's higher than people were predicting, simply because there's sort of a question about whether or not new voters were going to be would turn out to vote, right? Were they disillusioned? Did they see any option for them in the sort of constellation of Malaysian political parties. So in terms of, I'm not sure I got your exact question in terms of the turnout. So in terms of like,
I was wondering if, so you see like this, transition towards a new party system in which you have like 3 coalitions instead of 2. Is that related to the fact that, or is it the case that in these elections you see a different composition of the electorate in terms of like, you mentioned like more young people, for example, to the polls for the very first time? Did that have an effect? Like, so do we see these political changes because there are new voters that are participating, that have different interests, different ideological inclinations, or whatever?
yeah, so I haven't done this research, but I was at a conference a couple weeks ago where some people have looked at voting trends in terms of age and how people are, how different groups, age cohorts were voting in the election. And what these the scholars who I saw were arguing is that older voters were voting for BN, right? So the BN people who had long pre-existing attachments to BN, maybe not surprisingly, kind of kept their existing party affiliation or party identity, kept on voting for BN. It's the youth vote, which BN has lost quite dramatically, and a lot of that vote has shifted to PN. And why that is, I think, is a number of different reasons. I think similar to the ones I mentioned before. One about this kind of idea that PN was the sort of cleaner alternative to BN. The other one, of course, is that, there are quite conservative trends in Malaysian youth. So Malaysian youth are more conservative than the older generations. And the more conservative coalition was able to appeal to those voters. And also PN had a very good online presence, which is quite surprising because PAS in some ways is a very, seems like a very old school party in the sense that they have a very well developed campaign machinery, get out the vote operation. Yet they also were very savvy in using things like TikTok and social media to appeal to younger voters. So yeah, I think it's hard to know what this means for sort of youth voting and turnout in the future, but I don't know if there's been analysis of, I guess the harder thing to figure out is first-time voters, right? There's no exit polling that we can look at to say first-time voters who are not youth, first of all, did they vote? And second of all, did they, what kind of choices did they make? But certainly, I think we'll have to see how this unfolds in terms of turnout, but also in terms of voter choice. Sorry, your second question. Yes. Oh, clientelism. Yes. So yeah, it's a great question. I think it's nothing has changed about the sort of fundamental structure of Malaysia's economy, right? Which is heavily state-led. State-owned enterprises known as GLCs still play a major part in the Malaysian economy. And so, state patronage is still an important aspect of Malaysian politics and society. That being said, I do think one striking aspect of this election and the previous elections is that, yes, the government of the day has access to the state machinery and can distribute whatever it would like in terms of inducements or promises for development and so on, but it doesn't seem to have made a difference, right? I mean, BN was the incumbent government at the time of the election and could make, granted they've lost a lot of their sort of former commanding power, but that's still a powerful machinery that they had at their disposal, but it didn't seem to fundamentally predict how the election was going to work. And so I guess it's true in writ broadly that, yes, it is true that Malaysian elections do involve a lot of this kind of patronage promises and so on, but voters have a significant enough amount of voters have voted not along those lines to in other words, it's not deterministic in any way. In terms of the rise of programmatic politics, I think to some extent, despite the sort of discussion about ethnicity does overlap with programmatic politics to some extent, because in Malaysia, ethnicity is tied to access to things like, if you're a Bumiputra or indigenous voter, you have access to certain things like quotas in the education system. Bumiputra companies or companies listed on the stock exchange have to have a certain amount of Bumiputra directors and so on. So there's programmatic policies tied up with ethnicity. And another aspect of this from the non-Malay side is to look at things like education, vernacular education, which is always like a huge issue for non-Malay voters. They want their children educated in a Chinese medium school or a Tamil language school. They want to protect and expand that kind of education policy. So programmatic politics, I think, has always been there to some extent, and even compared to other Southeast Asian cases, there is like a programmatic element to Malaysian parties that, despite all of this kind of fluidity and change, has still remained an important aspect of its politics.
I'd like to pick up on your concluding comment about democratization. And my first question is actually a series of queries. I mean, my first question is, it seems to me one way to look at the 2018 election was democracy versus dictatorship. This is a authoritarian regime in an electoral disguise, and we are challenging it. It's become extremely corrupt, but also highly authoritarian. And we're going to kick them out, and they were briefly successful in doing so. So the one thing I didn't really understand from your presentation was, is that completely gone? Is that cleavage or that issue, has that gone? Or I mean, and that also leads to the question, so how do Malaysians see their own political system? I mean, there's the political science perspective, which I'd like to hear more about. If you could elaborate a little bit, I think there'd be some interest in these liberal practices that you mentioned. There's the political science view of it, but how do Malaysian voters seem to view it? And do they seem to have moved on? That because there were some real issues after the fall of the PH coalition in 2020, whether the system had regressed again and so on. So, was that an issue? And I mean, that's something you mentioned in the conclusion, but I'm curious why it didn't play a bigger part in your analysis before then. And then a follow-up question is, so you talk about the fluidity of the electoral system, the fluidity of voters' attachments to parties. You talk about the rise of the youth vote, the decline, perhaps we can say, of clientelism. I mean, if nothing else, clientelism doesn't seem to have worked very well. If the ruling party with all the clientelistic advantage doesn't work, then people may say, well, look at these clientelistic structures, but then the question is, so how come they didn't function? So I think that as well as the issue of the three coalitions rather than two, suggests that the system is becoming more fluid. And so the question is, how does that relate to democratization? Is that perhaps a good thing? If you're an advocate of a greater democratization of the system, that you don't have a consolidated authoritarian dominant party, which is my final question. I'll get to it in a second. But is it a good thing that that there is this flexibility, fluidity in the system, that where democracy can kind of get in through the cracks?
I'll write these down so I don't forget.
And the final thing, is in regards to the dominant party, and I think that's a really good point. That's what we're looking at, a dominant party comparison. And the interesting thing, though, is you mentioned Mexico and Japan. Mexico was a similarly authoritarian system that became democratic and is now about to become authoritarian again. But never mind, that's another issue. It's moving back toward an autocratic path, it seems. Whereas Japan has moved somewhat, a little bit away from a dominant party system. Right now, it looks like it's consolidating again, but always as a democratic one. So this is a particular case of, well, that's actually a question. Does this seem to be a case of the decline of an authoritarian dominant party system? And therefore, back to my question about fluidity, does this indicate that we have even if people are not advocating for democracy, if that's not a major issue in the campaigns, if voters are not perceiving in those terms, as an unintended consequence, is the way this is shaping up something that is potentially talking about what comes next, potentially something that is promising for, greater democracy in Malaysia.
Thank you. So I'll take these in turn, I guess. So in terms of the authoritarian versus democratic cleavage, which came out in the 2018 election, I agree with you. I think that was I think a confluence of different events just happened to work very well for the positioning and branding of the different coalitions in 2018, leading to the overturn that we saw. Yet, yeah, I think in this election, my sense is that voters or the larger electorate, purely anecdotally, right? But I do think, especially in the more progressive elements of Malaysian society, I think there's pretty significant disillusionment with the whole process, the political process. So in the sense that after 2018, I think there's extremely high expectations that the new government, the PH government, was going to rapidly kind of change or democratize Malaysia's political system. And they really didn't, right? I mean, they very quickly lost control of the narrative, the sort of larger narrative of politics. They were kind of paralyzed by this question of succession, whether Mahathir was going to pass the baton to Anwar and all of this. So I think, and then of course you get the collapse of the government. And I was in Malaysia during the weekend that the government collapsed, unintentionally. I had no idea what was happening, but I was curious to see, I went to Dataran Merdeka in KL, which is sort of a major site where I was reading online that there's going to be a protest, and maybe 50 people showed up. I mean, it was the beginning of the COVID period, but I was struck by how little outcry there was from sort of the Malaysian public at this time, where the government had essentially collapsed because of these elite machinations. And I think a lot of that kind of disillusionment has persisted. So I don't think anyone went into this election with the illusion that it was going to be a make or break for the sort of reform agenda, especially because I think Pakatan Harapan, coming into this election, they knew that they were in kind of a weak position. They knew that they weren't going to, it was unlikely they were going to form the government. And then the big question was, well, was BN going to do well? Was PN going to do well? And in terms of the new government, I think because of the matchup that we see now, I think, I haven't been to Malaysia since the election, so I don't know how people are gauging that new situation. But I do think, that the signs, there have been a couple minor incremental reform things going on. The mandatory death penalty was abolished recently, but in a lot of other ways, for example, the thing of local elections. Malaysia is one of the few countries in world, actually, which doesn't have local elections. There's only 2 levels of government that are elected: the state governments and the federal government. And recently, the new government has said, well, we're studying this issue, so it's delaying the issue of local elections. There's Anwar. I haven't really been following closely this issue, but Anwar apparently is going to sit on the committee which will decide on whether Najib will get pardoned by the king, or a petition to the king to pardon Najib, who of course is jailed for his corruption. So I do think that the question of reform is probably not at the top of the mind for a lot of the government right now. Voter thoughts about, or sort of ordinary citizens and how they feel about the regime, or it's the regime type, or whether it's democratic or non-democratic. That's a good question. I actually don't know. I don't know if I've ever seen a survey which explicitly asks that question. My sense is, from ordinary discourse in Malaysia, even during the period of BN rule, it was discussed as a democracy. People didn't really say, unless they were either on the opposition side or sort of the more progressive, activist circles, they wouldn't really talk about Malaysia as being a semi-democratic or competitive authoritarian system or anything like that. It was sort of democratic institutions, right? It's a great question, whether people's perceptions have changed about the regime. over time. Let's see. Oh yeah, and in terms of whether or not this is sort of like a promising turn for Malaysian politics, thinking comparatively, right, with some of the cases you mentioned, and I do think, I would actually be optimistic in the long term about Malaysia's trajectory. That again, kind of thinking comparatively, if we look at Indonesia, right? So Indonesia, people who study Indonesia have the luxury of looking, 26 years, period of 25 years, and kind of looking at the long, halting progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, it's changed over time, but you can undoubtedly say, okay, there's been major change at the institutional level, political level in Indonesia, which is taking place. And Malaysia, we're still in the very early days of that process, if it happens. And I think it's also important to note that during COVID, Malaysia had the prime minister at that time, Muhyiddin Yassin, suspended parliament. There was emergency rule for 6 months in Malaysia, on, given consent to by the king, or on the advice of the king. So what that meant was that for 6 months, Malaysia was back to emergency rule, which of course it had during after the riots in 1969. And I think it's kind of underappreciated that is a flirtation with absolute sort of closed authoritarianism that didn't last. And thankfully, that period had sort of an expiration date. The emergency rule had an expiration date on it, and no one pushed for it afterwards. But I do think it does suggest that in some ways that constituency no longer exists, right? That the time for sort of backsliding into something even more authoritarian is, at least in the current period, is past, and it's not likely to happen again. I don't know if I got all of you. Did I answer all your questions, Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's a very useful way to think about things. I guess what I was pushing for is, even if it's not a conscious push for democracy, and I think that's a very interesting point about how Malaysians may generally perceive their political system. And interestingly, there wasn't a lot of outrage about the end of the PH government in 2020, and even the emergency rule didn't cause a lot of outrage, of course, there were COVID restrictions. But rather the unintended consequence of the system becoming increasingly competitive, that no one's able to dominate, and therefore, put it in very rational choice kind of terms, a lot of the major actors and parties have an incentive to keep it competitive. And there seems to be no coalition or party within that coalition strong enough to say, okay, we win and that's it. We will then change the rules too. And particularly, of course, when you have a coalition at the moment, which seems very awkward from a liberal democratic perspective, involving the old dictatorship party and the reformists, that seems very problematic. But if you look at it the way that, that enables BN to be kind of tamed, as it were, and the authoritarian impulse which drove that BN coalition for decades has vanished. And I think the other thing is there's just no real tolerance in that sense. Perhaps people don't push actively for democracy, but there's an intolerance for a move back to that old more closed authoritarian system.
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with that, and I think hopefully the best version of this is exactly what you're saying, that if no one coalition knows that can guarantee that they're going to stay in power, then everyone has an incentive to make things the playing field reasonably level for the different actors. And so that could be anything from for example, from giving equal constituency development funds to all MPs, right? Historically, they've only been given to ruling government MPs. Things like one aspect which I think will be interesting to see is something like the gerrymandering and malapportionment, because that does benefit the sort of Malay majority coalitions, because the Malay electorate is sort of split across a bunch of tiny districts where all the non-Malay voters are typically packed in larger districts, right? So from that perspective, maybe that kind of thing will have a bit of continuity because it does benefit some, maybe to the exclusion of others. But yeah, I think there's other aspects of it that could only if you're not sure whether you're going to stay in power, you kind of want to make things a little bit more equal.
Have one question from chat box, so I can just read that to you. It's from Behaviour. So the question is from Behaviour. Within Pakatan Harapan in 2022 election, DAP actually won more votes than Anwar's PKR. Do you see any internal challenge to Anwar's leadership position within Pakatan Harapan, possibly from an ethnic Chinese politician?
Thanks. That's a great question, and actually something I'm really interested in as well. So, one aspect, as you mentioned, DAP did they did better than PKR, but they also did better than UMNO. So DAP, a party which has traditionally represented ethnic Chinese minority interests, although they are making more of an effort to be sort of multi-ethnic, is a bigger party than the Malay majority party. But I think the DAP is a fascinating kind of example of what happens when a multi-ethnic, sure, Chinese majority in terms of its leadership and candidates, but multi-ethnic in message, a party like that starts winning quite a bit of power. And of course, as people have noted in the current cabinet, the DAP is underrepresented in terms of its power. It should have more cabinet positions than it does. But a lot of this, I think, relates back to the fundamental messages which came through, especially after 2018, was that a party like the DAP was seen or portrayed by its opponents as fundamentally threatening the rights of the Malays, right? That the DAP was basically controlling Mahathir at the time, and that they were going to, dismantle the system of special rights and privileges given to Malays and Bumiputras in the country. And the DAP has really kind of had to toe a line in terms of how they position themselves, where they very consciously have, at two different events, the DAP has basically explicitly said, we will never put forward a Chinese prime minister for the country, right? And I think there's a very clear acknowledgement of how divisive these issues can be. And perhaps the only way that they feel that they can position themselves in the current climate in Malaysia, which is to say they're a big party, they have a significant representation, but they're not going to fundamentally overturn or tinker with the sort of racial structure of Malaysian politics. And I think, they're not like the MCA. Of course, the MCA and BN, the Malaysian Chinese Association, was always sort of the party of representing Chinese interests. I don't think the DAP is the same as MCA. I think they have a lot more say there. It's a lot more influential in terms of the government compared to the MCA under BN. But it does suggest that the DAP in particular has to position itself in a way that's not going to challenge anything. So to answer your question, I don't think the DAP is going to challenge PTR within the government for any particular position. In fact, I think they're happy with any outcome which will, I assume they're happy with any outcome which will mean that they're staying in government, and this means a BN matchup is something that they're willing to have as well.
I have one more question. Yeah. So actually, because from Indonesia, and for me, like, Malaysia is not democracy. Like, how come you can't say that voting for the same prime minister that ruled for 2 decades as a real democracy? So do you really think that Malaysia is electorally competitive? Or is this a game of the old elites? They just changed the shirt. Because for me, I don't know, as an Indonesian, to imagine you vote for Suharto under PDIP, it's still not considered as democracy, right? So yes.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think maybe especially during the period of during the time, for example, when PH was picking Mahathir as the candidate, right, as their prime ministerial candidate, there were some who would say exactly that, like, you know, what does it mean that we're going to have, you know, this person, this prime minister who essentially was the architect for the entire regime, right, and designed a lot of the sort of structures which kept Malaysia undemocratic. How can you have him in power again? What, you know, does this mean sort of the same thing but in a new form? I would argue, I mean, you know, I'm not Malaysian, so Malaysians may have their own view, but from my perspective, I would take a more optimistic view, which is to say, yes, it is true that a lot of these players existed in former or were major players in former governments under the BN, under Pakatan Harapan, but I do think the stakes have changed. The dynamics are a lot different than they were under BM, and from a variety of angles, right? So for one, the prime minister no longer heads this dominant party. Now the prime minister has to genuinely discuss with the coalition, right, and figure out what is palatable for the coalition. On the one hand, that means I think the you know, reform agenda or bold institutional change is going to be tempered by what the different players want to do. But to go back to Mark's point, I think there is this kind of taming process, right? You're bringing authoritarian actors or actors who were part of an authoritarian government into a more democratic, more messy, more sort of it demands more consensus. It's not simply a command type of government anymore. I think that's a good thing, right? And you know, there's research about this idea of what are called authoritarian successor parties, right? So parties which existed under the authoritarian period now contesting under new dynamics. And this research has found that a lot of those parties do quite well under more democratic competition, right? And one perspective might be to say, oh, you know, it's the same old figures coming back into power, nothing's really changed. But really, these are actors who are competing under much more democratic circumstances than they were before. But yeah, you're right. I mean, compared to Indonesia, Malaysia institutionally is still has quite some, you know, some changes that could be made to make it more democratic. So I would say the electorally competitive part, I think, is undisputable, right? I mean, it's very clear that Malaysia is a more competitive place now. In terms of whether it's democracy or non-democracy, you know, I think that's kind of an assessment we'll have to make in retrospect, right? So to say, after we've seen what happens with this new government, is the general trajectory going to be towards more democratic reforms or not? And I think it's probably heading in that direction. I don't think there's signs of backsliding right now. But yeah, a lot of the same things are in place. You know, the defamation, you know, instrumentalization of defamation laws, and you know, using state incumbency for your own political purposes. But that being said, a lot of kind of what you might call an electoral democracy or flawed democracy, they have these elements as well. So it's certainly farther in that direction than it was previously.
If there are no further questions online or in the audience, then all that remains is to thank you very much for a very lively concluding seminar. And just to tell all those who follow CERC seminars regularly, we will be back same place in the coming semester beginning in September. So keep an eye out, please, on our website for information about coming talks. Thanks again, and wish everybody a good afternoon, early evening.